So we're talking a little bit about ventilation today. This is just going to be your standard residential ventilation. We're going to start off with steep pitch, and then we're going to go to a shallow pitch. Important part of the size up on a steep pitch roof particularly is location of your rafter tails. Rafter tails are the portion of the rafter that stick out underneath the roof. If you pay no attention to the rafter tails, you just set your ground ladder up wherever, and you set your roof ladder next to it, then your roof ladder could possibly end up straddling a rafter bay, which means that your cut is either going to be short or you're going to have to reach way too far out to make it. If, on the other hand, you line your ground ladder up with the rafter tails, since the width of a ladder spans approximately one rafter bay, you can set your roof ladder on the next rafter bay, leaving the next two bay of rafters for your 4x4 cut. So before we actually get into cutting on the roof, we're just going to go over some saw handling basics. And the first thing we want to talk about is the initial plunge through the deck. You see a lot of people trying to plunge through it with a tip. And what happens there is that pulley on the end with a chain going around it, it tends to just act like a wheel, and the saw just tends to run all over the deck without actually biting into it. You want to get up to full throttle and then get the bar against the deck at an angle. That way you get the best cutting surface against the deck as possible. Now the second thing is related to balance. Since it can initially be fairly difficult to get that saw to punch through the deck, you see a lot of people leaning their body weight into the saw. And then once the saw breaks through the deck, with all their body weight leaned forward, they tend to just fall forward and lose balance. And a roof is not a place we want to lose balance. So instead, get a nice centered stance. Now pretend there's a pivot point running right through the middle of your saw. And you're just going to use your arms to lever it down, and that'll create all the pressure you need to get through that deck. Now of course you don't want to force that saw into the deck, but you do need at least some initial pressure to get it to break through. Now when it actually comes time to cut your box, there's two key points to effectively locating structural members. So now once you're in the deck, pop that saw vertical so that you can feel those rafters when you come to them. If you try and cut through them at an angle, you'll cut through those rafters before you know it, because that small amount of surface area is going to allow you to cut through a lot quicker. Well, since we don't want to cut through our structural members, if we take it at a side-on angle like that, we're going to feel it a lot quicker. So you get your saw into the deck at a nice angle, then you pop it vertical so you can locate that center rafter. Now if when you roll that rafter, if you end up pulling it all the way out of the deck, go ahead and go back on that angle to get it in. Just make sure you pop it vertical again so that you can get a positive feel on that next rafter. And the other thing about finding your members has to do with the speed at which you move the saw through the deck. And you want to move it fairly quickly so you can feel when you hit up against those members. And you'll hear people say, you know, let the saw do the work, don't force the saw, and that's true. But at the same time, you need to give the saw enough motivation so that you can really feel that difference when you hit upon that rafter or that joist. If you're cutting slowly, you won't be able to feel the difference between moving slow because you're moving slow and moving slow because you've hit up against a structural member. Whereas if you're cutting more quickly, if the saw suddenly slows down, you know that's because you've hit a member. Now after you locate your member with your horizontal cut, instead of just cutting directly down that member, move the saw inboard a couple inches first before you make your vertical cut. That will accomplish two things. One, it'll guarantee you have a good overlap at the corners. And two, leaving that space alongside the rafter will prevent you from rubbing the saw along the rafter, which could significantly slow down your cut. And the last point is, never be in the path of the saw. Here you can see the wrong leg position. Either direction, if the saw slips, then it's going to go right into the firefighter's leg. At any time you should be able to continue that saw in its path of travel without it hitting anything. Once you have your saw on the deck, you don't want to bury the saw. You only want to go through to about that pulley, because OSB only being about 7/16 of an inch or so, and then your thin layer of comp or 3-tab, whatever, the overall decking is not that thick, so you don't need to bury that deep. If you bury your saw too deep, you're a lot more likely to cut through a structural member without knowing it.